The courthouse in Charleston, South Carolina was silent, except for the sound of expensive shoes clicking against marble floors. It was December 2006. 5 days had passed since James Brown, the godfather of soul, had died on Christmas morning. Inside a private conference room, 9 people sat around a polished oak table. They were family, siblings, children, a widow, and none of them were speaking to each other. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened a folder. What he read would ignite a legal war that would last over a decade and tear apart whatever remained of the Brown family legacy. But here's what made it so much worse. This wasn't the first will. It wasn't even the second, and depending on who you asked, it might not have been legitimate at all. By the time the inheritance was finally settled, James Brown's estate would be worth an estimated $400 million, and almost none of his children would see a penny of it. This is the story of how one man's fortune became a family's nightmare. Let's go back. James Joseph Brown was born in 1933 in Barnwell, South Carolina. Poverty, abuse, abandonment. He grew up with nothing and built an empire from rhythm and sweat. By the 1960s, he wasn't just famous, he was a cultural force. Papa's got a brand new bag. I got you, I feel good. Get up, A, for that thing. He didn't just perform music. He invented funk. He changed the DNA of American sound. But James Brown, the icon, and James Brown, the father, were two very different men. He was married 4 times. He had at least 6 acknowledged children, possibly more. His relationships were volcanic, passionate, violent, unstable. Women came and went. Money came and went. But the music never stopped. By the time he reached his 70s, James Brown had accumulated wealth most people couldn't imagine. Real estate across multiple states, royalties from hundreds of songs, publishing rights, trademark rights to his name and image, investments, cash accounts, and he had strong opinions about what should happen to it. When he died in 2000, 6 years before his death, James Brown signed a will. It was clear, it was specific, and it seemed designed to prevent exactly the kind of chaos that would eventually erupt. The bulk of his estate, millions upon millions, would go to the I Feel Good Trust, a charitable foundation meant to fund education for underprivileged children in South Carolina and Georgia. The kids who grew up like he did, the ones with nothing. His children would receive smaller distributions, enough to be comfortable, but not enough to fight over. Or so he thought. His widow, whoever that would be at the time of his death, would receive the family home and some personal assets. It was a plan. A clear one, but by December 2006, that will had been amended. Then amended again. Then possibly replaced entirely. And sitting in that conference room, nobody could agree on which version was real. The question that would haunt the Brown family for the next 15 years was simple and terrible. Did James Brown really want his children to have nothing, or did someone make sure of it? Understanding what happened requires understanding who these people were, not these celebrities. Not the musicians. The actual family members who woke up one morning and realized their father's death had just made them enemies. Deanna Brown Thomas was James Brown's daughter from his first marriage to Velma Warren. She was in her 50s when her father died. She'd spent her life in his shadow, performing as a backup singer, writing a book about him, trying to preserve his legacy while also coming to terms with who he really was as a father. Distant, demanding, often absent. Deanna had complicated feelings about the inheritance. She didn't expect millions, but she expected something. Recognition. Respect. A sign that she mattered. Yama Brown was another daughter, younger, from James Brown's second marriage to Deidre Jenkins. Yama had written her own memoir, detailing the abuse she witnessed growing up, the violence between her parents, the fear that lived in their household. She loved her father, but she also knew what he was capable of. Terry Brown was James Brown's son from his third marriage to Adrian Rodriguez. Terry had struggled for years, in and out of his father's favor, trying to build his own identity while carrying that impossible last name. Venetia Brown, Larry Brown, and Darrell Brown rounded out the known children, each with their own history, each with their own wounds. And then there was Tommy Ray Heaney. Tommy Ray had married James Brown in 2001. Or had she? That itself would become a legal nightmare. At the time of their marriage, Tommy Ray was still technically married to another man, a marriage she claimed was invalid, but that the state of South Carolina wasn't so sure about. She and James Brown had a son together, James Brown II, born in 2001. The boy was 5 years old when his father died. Tommy Ray insisted she was the legal widow. The children insisted she was an opportunist who had manipulated an elderly man. The truth, as it would turn out, was more disturbing than either side wanted to admit. In the weeks after James Brown's death, the family went through the motions. The funeral, the public mourning, the tributes. Tens of thousands of people came to pay their respects. He lay in state at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Icons from across the music world eulogized him, but behind closed doors, the family was already fracturing. The first reading of the will happened in early January 2007. The lawyer, a man named Albert Dallas, who'd worked with James Brown for years, explained the situation. There was a will from 2000, but there were also codicils, legal amendments, signed in 2005 and 2006. And there was confusion about what James Brown had actually intended. According to the 2000 will, the majority of the estate went to charity. The children would split approximately $6 million. Tommy Ray would receive the house and personal property, but the later amendments seemed to change things. Or did they? The language was vague. Some assets had been moved, some accounts had been renamed, and there were signatures on documents that some family members claimed looked wrong. Deanna Brown Thomas was the first to speak up. She asked a simple question. Where is the money? The estate was supposed to be worth hundreds of millions. Publishing rights alone were valued at over $80 million. Real estate holdings across South Carolina, Georgia, and beyond. Royalties that poured in every single day from radio play, streaming, licensing. So where was it? The lawyer explained that the estate was complex. There were debts, tax issues, ongoing litigation from James Brown's lifetime. It would take time to sort out. But Deanna pressed. She wanted an accounting, a full, detailed report of every asset, every account, every piece of property. And that's when things got strange. The lawyer hesitated. He said he would need to consult with the estate's executors. There were people, he explained, who had been appointed to manage the estate, trustees who would make decisions about distributions. Deanna asked who those people were. The answer made her blood run cold. One of the executors was a man named David Cannon, a former associate of James Brown's. Another was Albert Dallas himself, the lawyer reading the will, and the third was Adele Pope, James Brown's longtime friend and business associate. None of them were family. James Brown had specifically structured his estate so that his own children had no control over it. And sitting there in that conference room, Deanna realized something that would shape everything that followed. Her father hadn't just divided his money, he had locked them out entirely. The meeting ended badly. Voices were raised. Tommy Ray stormed out, claiming the children were trying to steal from her son. The children accused Tommy Ray of having manipulated their father in his final years, but everyone left with the same sick feeling. This wasn't going to be simple. This was going to be war. If stories like this pull you in, subscribing means you won't miss what happens next. To understand how the family got to this point, you have to understand what James Brown's life looked like in his final decade, because the seeds of this disaster were planted long before he died. James Brown in his 70s was not the man he had been in his prime. The energy was still there, the ego certainly, but age and illness were catching up. He still performed, still toured, but the pace was slower, and the people around him were changing. By the late 1990s, most of his children had limited contact with him. The relationships were strained. Years of absence, of broken promises, of watching their father choose his career over them, had left deep scars. Deanna had tried to maintain a relationship, but it was difficult. Her father was demanding, unpredictable. He could be warm one moment and cruel the next. Yama had distanced herself. After the violence she witnessed growing up, after her mother Deidre's struggles with James Brown's abuse, Yama needed space. She loved him, but from a distance. Terry was in and out of favor. Sometimes James Brown would bring him into the business, give him responsibilities. Other times, he would cut him off completely over perceived slights. Into this vacuum stepped other people, business associates, handlers, and Tommy Ray Heaney. Tommy Ray met James Brown in 1998 when she was performing as a backup singer. She was in her late 20s. He was sick. The relationship developed quickly, and by 2001, they were married in a ceremony in South Carolina. But there was a problem. Tommy Ray was still legally married to a man named Javed Ahmed, a man she claimed had married her only for immigration purposes, and whom she had been trying to divorce. The divorce hadn't been finalized under South Carolina law. That made her marriage to James Brown potentially invalid. Bigamy isn't recognized. If Tommy Ray was still married to someone else, she couldn't legally be married to James Brown. This should have been a red flag. It should have been resolved immediately, but it wasn't. Instead, James Brown and Tommy Ray lived as husband and wife. They had a son. They appeared together publicly, and James Brown, whether out of love or stubbornness or something else, treated her as his legal spouse. The children watched this happening and said nothing, not because they approved, but because confronting their father about anything was nearly impossible. He didn't tolerate criticism. He didn't tolerate questions about his personal life, so they stayed quiet. And Tommy Ray became more embedded in James Brown's world. By 2004, she was making decisions, controlling access, deciding who could see James Brown and who couldn't. Deanna noticed it first. She would call to speak to her father, and Tommy Ray would answer. The calls wouldn't go through. What if they did? The conversations would be short, supervised, with Tommy Ray hovering in the background. Yama experienced the same thing. She would try to visit, and the visits would be cancelled at the last minute. Or she would arrive and be told her father was too tired, too busy, unavailable. Terry was cut off almost entirely. There had been an argument. Something about money Terry claimed his father owed him. And after that, James Brown refused to speak to him. The children began to suspect that Tommy Ray was isolating their father, but they didn't know what to do about it. In 2004, something else happened that should have alarmed everyone. James Brown was arrested on domestic violence charges. Tommy Ray had called the police, claiming he had assaulted her. There were photographs, bruises, evidence. It wasn't the first time. James Brown had a long history of domestic violence. His third wife, Adrienne, had called police multiple times. There were restraining orders, court cases. It was a pattern, but this arrest was different because James Brown was older now, frailer, and the optics were terrible. The case was eventually settled. Tommy Ray declined to press charges. They reconciled. But the incident left questions. Why had she called the police if she wasn't going to follow through? Was it leverage? A warning. The children didn't know, but they noticed that after the arrest, James Brown's will was amended. The first codicil, signed in 2005, made small changes. Some assets were some language was clarified. But then, in 2006, another amendment, and this one was more significant. According to documents filed later, the 2006 codicil reduced what Tommy Ray would receive and increased a charitable component. But the wording was strange. Lawyers who reviewed it later said it read like someone had tried to draft legal language without quite understanding how to do it properly. And the signature, some family members would later claim, didn't look quite right. But none of this came to light immediately. James Brown was still alive. The will was sealed, and the family was scattered, each dealing with their own complicated feelings about a father who had given them his name, but very little else. Then came Christmas, 2006. James Brown died at Emory Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta at 1:23 in the morning on December 25th. The official cause of death was congestive heart failure related to pneumonia. He was 73 years old. Tommy Ray was at the hospital. So were some of his children. There are conflicting accounts of who was in the room, who said goodbye, who was kept away. But what's clear is this. Within hours of his death, the battle lines were drawn. Tommy Ray immediately claimed widow's rights. She asserted control over the funeral arrangements, the estate, everything. She presented herself as the grieving spouse, the mother of his youngest child, the woman who had been by his side. The children, led by Deanna, immediately challenged her. They didn't recognize the marriage as valid. They didn't trust her. And they wanted answers about what had happened in their father's final years. The funeral was tense. Family members barely spoke to each other. Tommy Ray sat in the front row with James Brown too. The other children sat separately. The division was visible, public, painful. And then came the will reading. That meeting in the Charleston conference room where this story began. When Deanna asked where the money was, she wasn't being greedy. She was being specific. Because she had done research. She had looked at her father's royalty statements, his real estate holdings, his business ventures, and the numbers didn't add up. The estate claimed it was worth approximately $100 million. But independent music industry analysts estimated James Brown's catalog alone, just the publishing and royalty rights, was worth 3 to 4 times that. So where was the rest? The executors, David Cannon, Albert Dallas, and Adele Pope, said everything was accounted for, but they were vague. They promised a full accounting would come later. They asked for patience. Deanna didn't have patience. She hired her own lawyer, a man named Robert Rosen, an estate attorney with experience in Havalio celebrity cases. She asked him to investigate. What Rosen found was alarming. In the months before James Brown's death, significant amounts of money had moved. Assets had been transferred, accounts had been written, and much of it seemed to have happened without James Brown's full knowledge or understanding. There were cashier's checks, some for hundreds of thousands of dollars, signed by James Brown, but with no clear explanation of where the money went. There were property transfers. Real estate that had been in James Brown's name was suddenly in the name of various LLCs and trusts that the family had never heard of. And there were contracts, licensing deals, agreements to sell certain rights, all signed in 2005 and 2006, all during the period when Tommy Ray was controlling access to James Brown. Rosen brought this information to Deanna. She confronted the executors. She demanded explanations. And that's when the executors made a decision that would define the next decade of litigation. They froze the estate. In February 2007, just 2 months after James Brown's death, the executors petitioned the court to halt all distributions. They claimed there were too many questions, too many challenges, too much uncertainty about the validity of various claims. The estate would remain locked until everything could be resolved. What this meant in practice was that nobody got anything. Not the children. No, not Tommy Ray. Not the charities James Brown had supposedly wanted to benefit. The I Feel Good Trust. The educational foundation that was supposed to receive the bulk of the estate was never funded. The scholarships for underprivileged kids never materialized, and the legal fees began to pile up. Because everyone lawyered up. Deanna had her attorney. Tommy Ray hired a team. The other children found their own representation. The executors had the estate's lawyers, and every single one of them was billing by the hour. In March 2007, Tommy Ray filed a motion claiming her widow's rights under South Carolina law. Even if the marriage was technically invalid, she argued, she had lived as James Brown's wife. She was entitled to a widow's share under South Carolina law. That would be 1/3 of the estate. The children immediately filed an opposition. They argued the marriage was bigamous and therefore void. Tommy Ray had no legal claim. The court scheduled a hearing. But before that hearing could happen, something else emerged. Something that changed the entire landscape of the case. A woman named Lala Brown came forward. She claimed to be James Brown's wife. Not a former wife, not an ex. She claimed to have been married to James Brown at the time of his death. According to documents she produced, she and James Brown had married in the 1970s during his marriage to Deidre again. The marriage had never been annulled or divorced. If true, this meant every subsequent marriage James Brown had entered, including his marriage to Tommy Ray, was invalid. It meant the entire structure of the estate was built on a false premise. The children didn't know what to believe. Was Lala Brown telling the truth? Or was this another person trying to grab a piece of the money? The court ordered an investigation. Marriage records were subpoenaed. Witnesses were called. And while this was happening, while the court tried to figure out who, if anyone, was actually James Brown's widow, the estate remained frozen. Months turned into years. By 2008, the legal bills had consumed over $2 million from the estate. Money that could have gone to the children, to charity, to anyone, was instead paying lawyers to fight each other. And the family wasn't just divided, they were destroying each other. Deanna and Tommy Ray weren't speaking at all. When they appeared in court, they sat on opposite sides of the room. Their lawyers communicated through formal letters, cold and hostile. But it got worse. The children began to turn on each other. Terry Brown broke ranks. In 2008, he filed his own separate claim, arguing that he had been promised certain assets by his father and that those promises should be honored regardless of what the will said. This infuriated Deanna. She saw it as Terry undermining their collective fight against Tommy Ray and the executors. She accused him of being selfish, of caring only about himself. Terry shot back that Deanna had appointed herself leader of the family without asking anyone's permission. He claimed she was trying to control the narrative, control the litigation, control everything. Yama tried to stay neutral, but she was pulled into the conflict. Different family members pressured her to take sides. Choose Deanna or choose Terry. Support Tommy Ray's exclusion or acknowledge that maybe James Brown had actually loved her. The pressure was unbearable. And still, nobody had received a penny. In 2009, 3 years after James Brown's death, the South Carolina Supreme Court finally ruled on Tommy Ray's status. The ruling was complex. The court found that Tommy Ray's marriage to James Brown was indeed invalid due to her prior marriage to Jave Domed. She was not legally a widow. However, the court also found that Tommy Ray and James Brown had entered the marriage in good faith, believing it to be valid. Therefore, she was entitled to certain protections under South Carolina's putative spouse doctrine. The ruling gave Tommy Ray some rights, but not full widow's rights. She would receive a settlement, but not 1/3 of the estate. The children celebrated. Finally, a victory. Finally, validation that Tommy Ray had been an interloper, but the victory was hollow. Because the ruling didn't resolve the fundamental question: what had happened to all the money? And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. In 2010, a forensic accountant was finally brought in to examine the estate's finances in detail. His name was Michael Jackson, no relation to the other Michael Jackson, and he was considered one of the best in the business. What he found was a financial massacre. Between 2000 and 2006, the years when James Brown should have been at his wealthiest, his peak earning years captured in perpetual royalties, over $50 million had vanished, not spent on lavish lifestyle, not donated to charity, just gone. There were payments to shell companies that didn't seem to provide any real services. There were consulting fees to people nobody could identify. There were asset transfers that made no business sense. And much of it had happened in 2005 and 2006, the final 2 years of James Brown's life. When he was sick, when his judgment was compromised, when Tommy Ray was controlling access. The accountant's report was damning. He concluded that James Brown had likely been the victim of financial exploitation in his final years. But by whom? The executors pointed fingers at Tommy Ray. She had the access. She had the motive. She had isolated James Brown from his children and his longtime business associates. Tommy Ray pointed fingers at the executors. They were the ones managing the estate now. They were the ones who couldn't account for the money. Maybe they were covering their own mismanagement, and the children pointed fingers at everyone. Tommy Ray, the executors, even each other. Because here's what the accountant couldn't determine: where the money went. The shell companies had dissolved. The consultants couldn't be located. The paper trail led to dead ends. Someone had systematically drained James Brown's estate, and they had done it so carefully, so deliberately, that tracing it was nearly impossible. The court ordered further investigation. Federal authorities were notified. The IRS got involved because if money had been hidden, taxes hadn't been paid, and the estate remained frozen. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. In 2011, 5 years after James Brown's death, a storage unit in Augusta, Georgia was opened as part of the estate inventory process. Inside were boxes and boxes of documents, personal papers, letters, contracts, and recordings. One of the boxes contained cassette tapes. Dozens. They were labeled with dates from 2003 to 2006. Someone had been recording James Brown's private conversations. The tapes were turned over to the court, and what they contained was heartbreaking. They were recordings of James Brown in his final years, confused, sometimes disoriented, being walked through the signing of documents he didn't understand. In one recording, a voice, identified later as belonging to a business associate whose name has never been publicly released, guided James Brown through signing what appeared to be a transfer of assets. James Brown asked, "What is this for?" The voice said, "Just routine business, Mr. Brown. We've been over this. Do you remember?" James Brown said, "I don't remember. My head is cloudy today." The voice said, "That's the medication. You're fine. Just sign here." In another recording, James Brown was discussing his will. He was talking about wanting his children to be taken care of. He was talking about education, about giving kids opportunities. And then there was a gap on the tape. When the recording resumed, James Brown was signing something. But the conversation had shifted. Now they were talking about tax efficiency, about trusts, about complex financial structures that James Brown clearly didn't understand. Someone asked him, "Do you understand what you're signing?" James Brown said, "Yes." But his voice was weak, uncertain. The person said, "And you agree this is what you want?" James Brown said, "If you say so." These tapes were explosive. They suggested that James Brown, in his final years, had been manipulated into signing documents that he didn't comprehend, that went against his stated wishes, that benefited people other than his intended heirs. But the tapes also raised a terrible question. Woe may them, if someone was recording these conversations. It meant they knew something wrong was happening. It meant there was a witness. Someone who had evidence of the exploitation, but had stayed silent. The court launched an investigation into the source of the tapes. The storage unit had been rented under a corporate name, traced back to one of the dissolved shell companies. The rental agreement had been signed with an illegible signature. It was another dead end. But the tapes had an effect. They shifted public perception. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family squabbling over money. This was potential elder abuse. This was financial exploitation of a sick, vulnerable man. The South Carolina Attorney General's office opened a criminal investigation, and the family, already fractured, splintered completely. Because the tapes revealed something else, something nobody wanted to acknowledge. Some of the voices on the tapes were family members. Not the children, but extended family, cousins, in-laws, people who had been around James Brown in his final years. People who had been trusted. People who had apparently stood by while he was being manipulated. Deanna listened to those tapes and realized that people she had trusted, people she had grown up with, had betrayed her father. And she realized something even worse. Her father had died alone, surrounded by people, yes, but alone. Nobody had protected him. Nobody had stopped what was happening. The guilt was crushing. She withdrew from the case for several months. Her lawyer continued the fight, but Deanna couldn't face it. The litigation, the accusations, the endless court appearances, all of it felt obscene now. Her father hadn't wanted this. He had wanted his money to educate children, and instead, he was being consumed by lawyers and investigators, poisoning what was left of his family. But the case went on without her. In 2012, the criminal investigation concluded without charges. The Attorney General's office determined that while there was evidence of financial irregularities, there wasn't enough to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The money was gone. The people who took it, if they could even be identified, had covered their tracks too well. The estate litigation, however, continued. By 2013, 7 years after James Brown's death, a settlement was finally proposed. The terms were grim. The estate, which had been valued at $100 million in 2006, was now worth approximately $40 million. Legal fees and investigative costs had consumed the rest. Of that $40 million, approximately half was tied up in ongoing royalties and licensing deals that couldn't be liquidated without destroying their value. The liquid assets, the actual cash available for distribution, amounted to about $23 million. The proposed settlement would divide this money among the various claimants. Tommy Ray would receive approximately $6 million as part of her putative spouse settlement. The children would split approximately $9 million. The remainder would go to legal fees, taxes, and administrative costs. The I Feel Good Trust, the charity James Brown had wanted to create, would receive nothing. There wasn't enough left. The children had a choice. Accept the settlement or continue fighting and risk losing even more to legal fees. It was a brutal calculation. Accept a fraction of what they should have inherited, or fight on principle and potentially end up with nothing. Deanna wanted to fight. She argued that accepting the settlement meant letting the people who had stolen from her father get away with it. It meant betraying his legacy. But the other children were tired. Yama was exhausted, emotionally and financially. She had her own legal bills. She had a life she needed to get back to. Terry had already spent years in litigation. He was ready for it to be over. One by one, they agreed to the settlement. Deanna was the last holdout. She refused for months, but eventually, even she had to acknowledge reality. In 2014, 8 years after James Brown's death, the settlement was finalized. Each of the 6 acknowledged children received approximately $1.5 million. For most people, that's life-changing money. But for the children of James Brown, children of a man whose estate should have been worth hundreds of millions, it felt like an insult. And the money came with conditions. They had to sign releases. They had to agree not to pursue further litigation. They had to accept that they would never know the full truth of what happened. Tommy Ray took her $6 million and disappeared from public life. She and James Brown, too, moved away from South Carolina. She gave no interviews. She made no public statements. The executors, David Canaan, Albert Dallas, and Adele Pope, were removed from their positions after the settlement, but they were never charged with any wrongdoing. They claimed they had done their best in a difficult situation. The shell companies that had received James Brown's money were never fully traced. The people behind them were never identified, and James Brown's legacy, the thing he had worked his entire life to build, was shattered. But the story doesn't end there. Because in 2020, 14 years after James Brown's death, something unexpected happened. A journalist named Jason Cherkis published a long-form investigative piece about the James Brown estate. He had spent years researching, interviewing family members, reviewing court documents, talking to lawyers, and he had found something. Buried in financial records, hidden in a series of complex transactions that the forensic accountant had flagged but couldn't fully trace, was a pattern. Money had flowed from James Brown's accounts to a series of LLCs. Those LLCs had then made payments to consultants, and those consultants had connections to people very close to the estate administration. Cherkis couldn't prove criminal activity. The statute of limitations had long since passed anyway, but he could show the connections. He could demonstrate that people who were supposed to be protecting James Brown's interests had financial ties to the entities that drained his estate. The article was devastating. It named names. It showed documents. It laid bare how a vulnerable elderly man had been systematically exploited by people he trusted. Deanna Brown Thomas read the article and wept. Not because she learned anything new. She had suspected much of it for years, but because it was finally public, finally validated. Her father had been betrayed, and now the world knew. But validation doesn't bring back money. It doesn't undo years of family destruction. It doesn't fund the scholarships James Brown wanted to create. Today, the James Brown estate continues to generate revenue. His music still plays. His influence still resonates. Streaming has created new income sources that didn't exist when he died. But the family that should have benefited sees very little of it. The settlement they signed locked them into fixed payments. Any new revenue goes to the estate structure, the administrators, the ongoing legal and business costs. Tommy Raheny and James Brown, too, are reportedly living quietly in California. She has never spoken publicly about the estate battle. James Brown, too, now in his 20s, has stayed out of the public eye entirely. Deanna Brown Thomas continues to advocate for her father's legacy. She speaks at events. She works to preserve his image. But she does it without the financial support the estate should have provided. Yama Brown wrote another book. This one about her journey through the estate litigation, about what it taught her about family and money and forgiveness. Terry Brown passed away in 2020. He died never having fully reconciled with his siblings. The estate battle had poisoned those relationships beyond repair. The I Feel Good Trust was eventually established in 2015 with a small endowment from remaining estate assets. It provides a handful of scholarships each year, nothing like what James Brown had envisioned. And the question that haunts everyone involved remains unanswered. What happened to the money? Conservative estimates suggest that at least $75 million went missing. Some estimates go as high as $150 million. That money didn't evaporate. It went somewhere. Someone has it. Someone benefited from the systematic dismantling of James Brown's estate. But they were careful. They covered their tracks. They exploited a sick man's confusion, his isolation, his trust, and they got away with it. Because here's what the James Brown inheritance case reveals about American estate law. It's not designed to catch sophisticated thieves. It's designed to mediate disputes between honest actors. When someone deliberately sets out to loot an estate, when they create shell companies and false trails and complex financial instruments, when they isolate the victim and control access and manufacture documentation, the legal system struggles to respond. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the money is long gone. The statute of limitations is run out. The evidence has been destroyed or hidden, and the family is left fighting each other instead of the real culprits. Because that's the truly insidious thing about what happened to the Brown family. The theft destroyed the money, but the inheritance battle destroyed the relationships. Diana and Yama barely speak anymore. The settlement negotiations brought out accusations, resentments, old wounds. They said things to each other that can't be unsaid. The extended family is fractured beyond repair. Cousins who grew up together are now strangers. Family reunions don't happen. James Brown's grandchildren are growing up, not knowing each other. The next generation has inherited the animosity without even understanding why. This is what the inheritance did. Not the money itself, but the fight for it. The loss of it, the betrayal around it. It turned family into enemies. And the cruelest irony is that James Brown himself bears some responsibility. Not for the theft. He was a victim of that. But for the structure he created. He cut his children out of estate control because he didn't trust them to manage his legacy. Maybe he was right. Maybe they would have fought over it. But by removing them entirely, by giving power to outside executors, he created a vacuum that other people exploited. He was trying to prevent exactly what happened. And in doing so, he guaranteed it. There's a recording from 2005, one of the ones found in that storage unit, where James Brown is talking about his will. He says, "I want my kids taken care of. I want them to have enough. But I don't want them fighting. I've seen what money does to families. I don't want that." The person with him says, "That's why we're setting it up this way. So there's no confusion, no fighting." James Brown says, "You promise me that. You promise me they'll be okay." The person says, "I promise, Mr. Brown." That promise was a lie. James Brown died, believing his children would be taken care of. His legacy would be protected, and his money would educate kids who needed it. None of that happened. His children got a fraction of what they should have inherited. His legacy is now associated with one of the ugliest estate battles in entertainment history. And the kids who needed scholarships never got them. The only people who truly benefited were the lawyers. And whoever has that missing money. And the Brown family, what's left of it, lives with the aftermath. Diana Brown Thomas said in an interview in 2022, 16 years after her father's death, "I've forgiven a lot. But I'll never understand how people who claim to love my father could do what they did. I'll never understand how they sleep at night." She paused, then added, "And I'll never understand why we couldn't just be a family Why the money had to matter more than that. That's the question at the heart of the story. Not who stole the money, though that matters. Not what loopholes they exploited, though that matters too. But why inheritance so reliably destroys the thing it's supposed to protect. Family. Because James Brown wasn't unique. This story plays out in different forms, with different details, in families across the world every single day. Someone dies, they leave money, and the people who are supposed to love each other turn into adversaries. They hire lawyers. They make accusations. They stop speaking. They nurse grievances until they calcify into permanent rifts. And years later, when the money is gone or settled or divided, they look around and realize what they've lost. Not just inheritance, but each other. The James Brown estate case is closed. The legal proceedings are over. The money, what's left of it, has been distributed, but the damage is permanent. And somewhere, whoever took that $75 million is living a very comfortable life, knowing they'll never be caught, never face consequences, never have to answer for what they did. Because they didn't just steal money, they stole a family's last chance to heal. They stole the legacy James Brown wanted to leave. And they stole the future of thousands of kids who will never get the scholarships they deserved. That's the real inheritance. Not what was left, but what was taken. And you can't litigate that back.